Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to spend some time talking about social and emotional development. Um, this would be a good time to remind you that if you are not in the habit of keeping up with the assigned readings that I give you every week, try to get back into that habit. This particular lecture covers a ton of material. There is a lot of detail. There are a lot of different stages with different theorists, and frankly, I just can't get through all of it in this one lecture that I try to keep relatively short. And so, if you're not doing those weekly readings, I would highly recommend that you get back into that habit and kind of check your notes along with the textbook to make sure that you get all of the details that you need over this content, because there's a lot going on with social and emotional development. So we're going to start with infants, and we're going to start with kind of these two interesting experiments. I'll try to move my face out of the way a little bit here. Uh, First, a man named Harry Harlow. And so in the 1950s, there was a psychologist named Harry Harlow who was curious about the impact of the relationships between children, infants, and their caregivers. There was this kind of cultural push, particularly in the United States, where children should be seen but not heard, and that we need to provide nourishment and food and protection, but it's not that important to provide comfort and love. And Harlow thought that that was bogus, that that just simply wasn't true. And so he set up these series of experiments where he took these really cute rhesus monkeys. If I can get my slide to progress here, and he presented them with essentially two possible caregivers. One caregiver was this wire mother, the chicken wire, cold, didn't offer any kind of comfort or anything, but it did offer nourishment in the form of food. And then there was a second kind of surrogate mother that was very similar, except for it had a kind expression on its face, and it was wrapped in this warm kind of terry cloth that the monkeys could kind of lean up against and literally feel warm and feel comforted. And what Harlow did is he studied these monkeys to see where do they spend their time. And sure enough, it probably shouldn't be too surprising, monkeys would cling to and spend up to 23 hours a day with these cloth mothers. Now, some of the initial pushback was that's not really love, it's just more comfortable. Like if you had to sit somewhere all day, would you rather sit on something that's this hard wire, or would you rather sit on something that's soft? So Harlow took this a step further, and he tried to think, okay, well, how could I demonstrate that these monkeys did feel actual psychological comfort in addition to the physical comfort of a soft, towel or something? And so, what Harlow did was he came up with a number of different ways to terrify and scare these baby monkeys. And sure enough, the infant monkeys, when terrified, given an equal choice between a wire mother and a cloth mother, they would run to the cloth mother. In fact, they would even go out of their way and Uh, um, run shorter distances to be with the cloth mother when the wire mother was perhaps safer and further from the threat. And so this is showing us that these monkeys needed, that they desired this attachment, this comfort from a caregiver, and that attachment is based off of love, not just someone that provides nourishment and food. Research on attachment was furthered by a woman named Mary Ainsworth. Let me move my face again here. Mary Ainsworth, what she did was she put infants in what she calls a strange situation. And so volunteers would come into her laboratory, and they would have kind of this room that the infants had never been in, so it's kind of a scary thing for an infant. You're in this strange room with your mother, and then a stranger would walk in and kind of talk with the mother for a few minutes, and then the mother would leave, and the mother would leave the infant with a stranger for a few minutes and then come back. And what Mary Ainsworth did was they would study how do the infants react to this strange situation. And she found that infants kind of would react in a couple of different ways depending on the attachment that they have with their caregiver. Again, attachment being the relationship between an infant and their caregiver. Ainsworth was able to separate these into two main categories, what she calls secure attachment and insecure attachment. This next slide kind of looks at the differences between secure and insecure attachment. I'm not going to read every element of these, you may need to. I'm struggling today. I apologize. Um, it may help to pause the video and you can kind of look at these. But the idea is most infants had secure attachment. In fact, over 60% of the infants that were studied had secure attachment. And these children, they felt very safe when the mother was around. They would explore the room, they would try to play with new toys. Now they did feel distress when the mother left, but when the mother returned, they were able to be comforted. You contrast that with insecure attachment, specifically with the anxious style. In insecure attachment, the infants were very clingy to the mother. They didn't want to explore the room, even when the mother was present, right? They just were hanging on for dear life, not sure what was happening. And then when the mother would leave, the infant would be just wildly upset. And even when the mother returned, it would take a long time to settle the infant down, to comfort them. And then you contrast that with the insecure attachment avoidance style. And with these infants, they were somewhat indifferent to whether or not the mother was even there or not. And so when you start to think about this, like why would infants react to this situation differently? Well, there's back to this debate between nature and nurture, right? The nature element ties in things like temperament, and we haven't spent a lot of time talking about temperament, but temperament is kind of the biological basis of personality. And you can make the argument that some infants are just more easygoing, and they're more easily comforted, and they're predictable with their feeding schedules and their sleeping schedules, and they're more relaxed, whereas other infants are a little more high strung and they have a more difficult temperament. Perhaps they're more unpredictable when it comes to when they're hungry and when they sleep, and they're not easily comforted and they cry often. And so the nature argument for attachment is perhaps these babies simply have different temperaments. The nurturing element, however, is the actual relationship between the parent and the child themselves. Does the parent respond appropriately, efficiently to the infant's needs? If the infant is tired, does the caregiver respond and put them down for a nap? If the infant is hungry, do they get food right away? If they soiled their diaper, do they get changed right away? And if an infant's needs are not being met appropriately and efficiently, then perhaps they go on and develop these insecure attachments, whether that be avoidant or anxious. It brings us into this interesting element of parenting styles and how we, as we continue to grow beyond infancy into childhood and into being our adolescence and our teenage years, there are different ways that parents can approach parenting. And so, again, lots on this slide. You may need to pause. But psychologists have divided parenting styles into kind of some different categories. You can look at this matrix here. The first thing that we want to address is whether or not that parent is supportive. And so, where's the focus? Is the focus on the child and the child's desires and goals and dreams? And is the parent supportive of those things? What we call child centered parenting. Or is the child just present, but it is really parent centered? Depending on whether the parenting style is supportive or unsupportive, it leads to different types of parenting. And then also expectations. Do we have high expectations for children? Demanding maybe has some negative connotation there, but think, does the parent expect much out of their children? Do they expect them to work hard, to be kind, to be successful, or do they have little to few expectations, like, hey, you're a kid, I don't expect you to do very much? Depending on that element of parenting, it can lead to some different styles, and you can see how they kind of fall together in this matrix. So if we look at authoritative parenting, that is arguably the best parenting style. With authoritative parenting, first of all, communication goes back and forth, where a child has a voice in the way that they are being raised. If there is a rule in the home that's being made, the child can debate that. Now, the parent still has like the ultimate veto power, but let's say a parent says, "I want your curfew to be 10 p.m." And the child makes a decent argument of why, well, maybe it should be midnight, right? Like, I like to go to the movies, and movies usually don't get out until after 10 p.m. and X, Y, and Z. And maybe the parent compromises, says, you know what, you make up some good points. How about it's 11? Or maybe they say, no, it's 10 o'clock. I hear you. I understand you, but it's still going to be 10. It's bi directional communication, it's responsive, and it's child centered. You compare that to authoritarian. It's the biggest mistake that students make is confusing authoritative with authoritarian because they look really similar. With authoritarian, think it's unidirectional communication. It is the because I said so parenting style, right? Your curfew is 10 o'clock. Well, why is my curfew 10 o'clock? Because I said it's 10 o'clock. So, this kind of one way unidirectional communication is very indicative of authoritarian parenting. It is kind of this power assertive parenting styles. Now, it should be noted that with authoritarian parenting, children are often do find a fair amount of like academic success because it's a strict environment and it's quite demanding. However, these same children sometimes struggle when they go out in the world and they're no longer under the thumb of their parents. And sometimes these are the kids that go a little crazy, a little wild their first year of college because they feel like they're free for the first time. And then if we look at the bottom left box there, permissive parenting, this is the idea where honestly it's kind of like the child or the teenager's in control. Like they're the ones setting the rules and the parents are like, okay, cool, as long as you're happy. This is this permissive parenting style. An advantage of this is children become quite independent at a young age. The disadvantage is sometimes they make some mistakes at a young age that are difficult to correct when they get older because they don't have that strict parent at home to kind of keep them in line through the experiences that they have had throughout their life. Not going to spend too much time talking about the bottom right box, but the idea behind the bottom right box is that if you have a parent who is unsupportive, right, it's very parent centered, and they don't have high expectations, then we call this a rejecting parenting style. The idea is behind a rejecting or neglecting parenting style, this can be either the result of or a contributing factor to kind of this insecure attachment that we discussed in the previous slide. Now, this slide is going to have a ton of information. And this is one of those things where you need to go into your textbook and just read more because the reality is I could have an entire lecture talking about this man, Erik Erikson. So, Erik Erikson has a really interesting backstory as far as he was born in Europe from a Danish mother and a German father. He moved to the United States. He constantly was going in and out of different schools, and he never really felt like he knew who he was. And he suffered what we might today refer to as an identity crisis, which is interesting because Erik Erikson was the first person to ever talk about an identity crisis. So if you're familiar with that phrase, identity crisis, that's Erikson. And Erikson argues that as we grow and mature socially and emotionally, that we progress through 8 predictable stages. And so this graphic has all of these 8 stages. This is one of those times in psychology where we kind of roll the dice and gamble a little bit. The reality is, the AP Psych curriculum says that you are responsible for knowing these 8 stages. In my mind, that's going to take a lot of time with little possible reward. Like you will probably have one multiple choice question about Erikson on the AP exam. It is also possible, because I've seen it before, that one of these terms on the slide shows up on an FRQ. And so we kind of have to gamble a little bit, right? How much time do we want to spend committing all 8 stages to memory, knowing that you're likely going to get one question about it? So rather than going through each and every stage, I'm going to hit the highlights. I'm going to talk about the stages that I've seen time and time again on the AP exam, the ones that you do need to spend some time studying. And if you feel like we're only scratching the surface and you want to dive in deeper, please make sure that you look at that textbook or send me an email. So here are these 8 stages. They you progress chronologically from birth into old age, and the idea is that within each stage you have a conflict. That's an important thing to know. Each stage you have a conflict, and how you resolve that conflict, that will impact your social development for the rest of your life. So you can kind of think of it as like this tree, right, where you're born, and in the first couple years of your life you are put in what's called the hope stage. And the hope stage, the conflict is, are you going to develop trust, Or are you going to develop mistrust? And you think, well, what is that based off of? Well, that's kind of based off what we've been talking about. It's based off uh, parent involvement and whether or not your needs are being met, right? The type of attachment you are developing. So if you have an infant in the first couple of years that has a very responsive, loving, comforting parent, they will likely develop trust, which means for the rest of their life, they've now gone this way. Whereas if they had a parent who was unresponsive, that didn't meet their needs, then they may develop mistrust. And for the rest of their life, the course of their life is now going down this road. And you can see that within each stage of these 8 stages, they branch into, are you going to solve the conflict over here, or are you going to solve the conflict over here? So when we look at these, the conflict, the way that this kind of slide is being shown, the conflict is going to be the kind of the top and the bottom. So in the hope stage, the conflict is trust or mistrust, right? And this next stage is what we call the will stage. And I don't believe you'll need to know the names of the stages, but the will stage, the conflict is autonomy or shame and doubt. So are children able to um, kind of control themselves? Are they starting to show some independence? If you think about this second stage, we're talking about 3, 4, 5 years old. Are they showing independence in the sense that they can pick out their own clothes to wear? They can pick out what games they want to play. They can maybe pick out what snack they want to eat, right? By providing these opportunities, these children can develop autonomy. Whereas if you have a parent that constantly says, you can't wear that, you can't eat that, you can't play that, then they may start to doubt themselves, right? If you have a child that has a fire truck and they're flying the fire truck through space and a parent says, fire trucks don't fly, what are you doing? What that does is that starts to cultivate this idea of shame and doubt. Again, the conflict where it splits. How is the personality going to develop, given the relationship that's taking place during this second stage? As we progress on that third stage, what we call the purpose stage, the next conflict, initiative or guilt, right? Initiative, are they becoming a leader? Are they showing like, hey, I like to draw pictures and that's what I want to do in my free time? Or I'm really interested in baseball and so I want to go out and throw the baseball around. I'm going to go ahead and skip up to the fifth stage. Of all 8 stages, the fifth stage is the one you need to know. You got to know the fifth stage. It's the stage that you are in right now. And theoretically, it's the one that Erikson spent the most time discussing. So the name of the fifth stage is the fidelity stage. And you can see it is kind of small right there, the fidelity stage. The conflict in the fidelity stage, which takes place from about 13 years old until late teens, early 20s, okay? So right where you are right now in adolescence, the conflict in the fidelity stage is identity or role confusion. In other words, you're trying to answer that question of who am I? Not like who am I as far as what is my name, right? But who am I as far as like what do I believe in spiritually? What do I believe in politically? How do I like to spend my free time? Who do I like to spend my time with? What do I want to do when I get older? Where do I want to live? Like trying to figure out who you are, right? And during adolescence, teenagers, they try on a lot of different hats. You have teenagers who try out different clubs and different sports and different social groups, and they are exploring the world trying to find their identity. And the kind of the healthy conclusion to this conflict is leaving the fidelity stage with a strong sense of who you are as a person. Whereas the other side of this road, this fork, is continued confusion with your identity. Now, the next 3 stages, the love stage, the caring stage, and the wisdom stage, is actually I'm going to discuss all of those in my next lecture. So don't worry about those stages 6, 7, and 8 just yet. Those all will be in our adulthood lecture. Um, Hopefully that makes sense with Erikson because there's a lot going on. Now there is a kind of a counter theory to Erikson's theory, and that is a theory by a guy named James Marcia. Now, with Erikson, again, it's 8 stages that everyone progresses through. It's chronological, it's based off of age. And so, according to Erikson, if he knows what your birth date is, he could tell you what stage you are in. And Marcia says, I don't know if that's exactly true, right? So, Erikson, right now, for example, would say that each and every one of you is still kind of confused about who you are as a person. Marcia says you might be confused about some things, but maybe there's elements of your identity that you're not confused about. And so Marcia believes that our identity development is not based off of our age. Our identity development is based off of these big commitments we've made in our life. So think about those things I was just talking about: what you believe in spiritually, what you believe in politically, who do you want to love, where do you want to live, what do you want to do with your life, what do you want to do with your free time, right? These are big commitments. Marcia says that depending on how you have resolved the commitment, you are in different stages of identity. So let's take, for example, the big commitment of going to college. Okay. Well, there are two factors that Marcia looks at. First of all, has the decision already been made, the commitment itself? If the decision has been made and it's present, that leads to a couple of different styles here. And if it hasn't, if the commitment is absent, you can kind of see the right hand side, then that identity will look different. And then the exploration. How much time did you spend weighing your options, right? Researching the possibilities. If you did that, it can lead to some kind of our top row. And if you didn't, it's the bottom row. So let's kind of break this down real quick. Trying to go to college, right? That's what you're trying to figure out. What are you going to do after Park Hill? Well, maybe you explore 10 different colleges. You get the brochures, you've done the research, you've looked at their possible majors and their location and tuition and all of that. And you have decided, I'm going to go to wherever. You're going to go to Truman State University, right? Perfect. We would say that you have identity achievement because you have, where's my mouse? You have committed, right? The commitment is present, and you explored all of your options. Maybe you've looked at all these colleges, you've gone on tours, you've got the brochures, right? You're doing the research, you're filling out applications, but you're not quite sure where you want to go yet. Well, in that case, the exploration is present, but the commitment has yet not yet been made. So we would say you are in moratorium. And the easy way to remember that is think you just need more time, right? I'm weighing my options. I don't know yet. I need more time. You're in moratorium. Maybe your grandfather went to Mizzou and your father went to Mizzou where he met your mother, and your older brother went to Mizzou, and the teacher says, hey, we're going to go to college. You're like, I'm probably just going to go to Mizzou, right? Well, in that case, the commitment has been made, it's present, but you didn't explore your options. This is what we call foreclosure. Easy to remember, the decision was made for you, right? So identity foreclosure, the decision has been made for you. Or it could be lots of you are like, I don't know where I'm going to go to college and I don't really care right now. So you haven't made a commitment and you also haven't really explored your options. It's identity diffusion, right? It's not on your radar at the moment, and that's okay as well. So, big contrast between Erikson and Marcia. Erikson is chronological, 8 stages. Each stage has a conflict. Marcia, it's not chronological, it's based off different commitments. And if you think about with Marcia, maybe you have identity achievement in regard to your religious beliefs, but you have maybe identity diffusion in regard to your political beliefs, right? And so with Marcia, you can be in kind of these multiple stages at once. We don't even really call them stages; they're just different elements of identity. Okay, we have just 2 more slides here. As we talk about identity development, it's also important that we spend some time looking at gender development. And so the most important thing to kind of start with is making sure we understand the difference between sex and gender. So sex is biological, right? In a previous lecture, we talked about 23 chromosomes, and the 23rd pair of chromosomes are our sex chromosomes. And so if you were looking at a person, are they biologically male where they have an XY chromosome, or are they biologically female where they have XX chromosomal pair? Gender, on the other hand, is socially constructed. So sex is biological. Gender is can be impacted by biological sex. However, there are more external cultural elements of gender as well. And so, gender identity would be the realization of your own gender, whatever that may be. And with gender identity often comes the element of gender roles. And so, those are the expected behaviors of males and females. And now we're starting to see kind of this challenge to traditional gender roles. I have this kind of cringeworthy, outdated book here that you can see on the screen. Boys are presidents, girls are first ladies. Boys fix things, girls need things fixed. And so this is a very kind of 1950s gender role that we are likely very familiar with this traditional gender role. As we advance culturally and as a society, we start to see a shift in that paradigm. And so our last slide looks specifically at this idea of, well, how do we form our gender identity that goes along with these roles? And there's kind of two leading theories. They're quite similar. I'm going to put them both up here for you. Think about the perspectives of psychology, right? And so we talk about all these different perspectives of psychology. Well, the middle finger of psychology is behaviorism, right? And we had a whole unit talking about behaviorism, and the idea of behaviorism is being taught or trained over time. And so the social learning theory is the behavioral perspective of how we develop our gender. And so, in other words, it's going to be based off of behavioralistic theory. We learn gender identity and gender roles based off observation. What do we see in the home? What do we see on TV? It's also based off reward and punishment. And so, if you have let's say you have a 4 or 5 year old boy who's playing with Barbies, and dad walks in the room and says, "Boys don't play with Barbies," right? And so, there's kind of this punishing element. Or you have, a 5 year old daughter who is, um, I don't know, rolling around, wrestling on the ground, and then gets punished for being too rough and tough. We see how with social learning theory, how that behavioral perspective can mold a particular gender. Now, there is overlap with this other theory, what we call gender schema theory. And to understand gender schema theory, this is the pointer finger, this is the cognitive perspective. Remember, we talked about schemas. Schemas are those file folders in our brains. It's how we organize information, how we think about information. And so, the idea behind gender schema theory is that we all have these file folders in our brain for what gender entails, right? And so, if we think about a masculine gender or a feminine gender, and we open up that file folder in our mind, what is included in there? And so, we learn from our culture what it means to be masculine or be feminine, and then adjust those behaviors accordingly to the theory or to the schema itself. Okay, lots of stuff with this slide. This might have been the most jam-packed lecture we've had all year long. If you need some help, if you are struggling on something, let me know. Otherwise, best of luck, everyone, and we'll chat soon.